They mocked him because he was poor, laughing as he stood in a borrowed suit at the edge of their wealthy world. But years later, the same man would return as a billionaire. And the revenge he carried back into that room would shock everyone who once believed he was nothing. Daniel Cross was the man they dismissed, a struggling worker with empty pockets and quiet dreams, while Richard Carter, a powerful tycoon, led the mockery. And Emily, the woman Daniel loved, watched in silence, choosing comfort over loyalty. They called his poverty a weakness, but they never asked why a poor man carried himself like someone who had already lost and already planned. They laughed at his hunger, but they never noticed the way he studied their faces, memorizing every insult, every smile, every door slammed shut in his face. And now, as Daniel steps back into their world with wealth they cannot explain, one question hangs in there like a held breath. How did the man they mocked for being poor become a billionaire? And what kind of revenge could make powerful people afraid of someone they once laughed at? The chandeliers of Sterling Heights estate glowed overhead, casting light onto marble floors polished so perfectly they reflected the faces of the powerful standing upon them. This was not a room for memories, it was a room built to forget people like Daniel Cross ever existed. Men in tailored suits exchanged quiet laughter. Women wrapped in diamonds sipped champagne that cost more than Daniel once earned in months. Power moved easily here, passed hand to hand through firm handshakes and practiced smiles. At the center of it all stood Richard Carter, silver-haired and broad-shouldered, a man who had never waited for doors to open because they always had. His wealth wasn't loud, it was assumed. Entire city blocks bore his influence, and tonight was meant to crown another victory. Everything is in place, a board member murmured. Richard nodded, whirling his champagne. It always is. Beside him, Emily Carter smiled when expected, laughed when required. She wore a designer gown that fit her perfectly, but something about her still felt unfinished, as though part of her had been left behind years ago and never retrieved. Her fingers tightened briefly around her glass when the announcer stepped up. "Ladies and gentlemen," the host said, voice echoing softly, "thank you for joining us tonight to celebrate the future of luxury living." Polite applause followed. "And now," he continued, pausing, "please welcome the chairman of Sterling Group." The double doors opened. The sound was soft, controlled, intentional. Daniel Cross stepped inside. Not hurried, not hesitant. A ripple of confusion swept through the hall. Emily's breath caught. Her smile vanished before she could stop it. Richard frowned. "Who is that?" he muttered, irritation forming before recognition could. Daniel walked forward, his suit dark and perfectly cut, the kind of wealth that didn't beg to be noticed. He didn't scan the room for approval. His eyes moved slowly, deliberately, landing on faces he remembered too well. Faces that once laughed. Faces that once turned away. Emily's champagne glass slipped from her fingers and shattered against the marble floor. Daniel didn't flinch. As he reached the stage, his gaze lifted, a calm, steadied hand. For a fleeting second, something unreadable passed behind his eyes. Not triumph. Memory. And somewhere deep beneath the polished floor and glittering lights, the past stirred the smaller room, a cheaper suit, and laughter that had once decided his worth. The laughter didn't end when Daniel left the party that night. It followed him. In the days that came after, it echoed in smaller, sharper ways, in the warehouse where supervisors suddenly watched him more closely, in the security post where his overtime hours were quietly removed, in the way people spoke to him as if poverty had stripped him of adulthood. One evening, Daniel stood outside Emily's apartment building, hands buried in his pockets, rehearsing words he wasn't sure would matter anymore. When she finally came down, she didn't invite him inside. "We need to be realistic," Emily said, folding her arms, her voice careful, practiced. "Love doesn't change facts." "What facts?" Daniel asked softly. She hesitated. That hesitation mattered more than her answer. "My father thinks you're holding me back." Daniel nodded slowly, as if he'd expected it. "And what do you think?" Emily looked past him, at the row of expensive cars parked along the curb. "I think I'm tired of being afraid of the future." She kissed his cheek. Not goodbye, not affection, but closure, and stepped away. As she turned, her phone vibrated in her hand. Daniel didn't mean to see it, but the screen lit up just long enough. "Don't worry, I'll take care of him." She quickly locked the screen, but the damage was done. Her eyes flicked to his face, searching to see if he'd noticed. He had. That night, Daniel walked home instead of taking the bus. The city lights blurred as memories surfaced, his mother's voice telling him never to react in anger. His father's quiet discipline, the strange way their life had collapsed without explanation years ago. 2 days later, security escorted Daniel out of the warehouse. Accusation, theft. No proof. No discussion. Just a signature stamped by a company owned by Richard Carter. Daniel stood outside with his final paycheck in hand, jaw tight, eyes steady. They thought they were erasing him. They didn't know they were activating something that had been dormant for years. That night, Daniel returned to his one-room apartment and knelt beside his bed. He pulled out the wooden box he had avoided for so long, and this time, he opened it. The wooden box felt heavier than it should have. Daniel sat on the edge of his bed, the room quiet except for the distant hum of traffic outside his cracked window. This apartment had never held secrets, only exhaustion, but the box did. It always had. He hadn't opened it in years. Not because he'd forgotten what was inside, but because opening it meant accepting that his life hadn't simply fallen apart. It had been redirected. The lid creaked softly as he lifted it. Inside lay 3 things, arranged with deliberate care. First, an old photograph. A younger man stood beside a glass building, one hand resting on Daniel's shoulder. His suit was immaculate, his expression calm, intelligent, watchful. Daniel's father. Second, a single gold cufflink, scratched along the edges, its design subtle enough to look ordinary unless you knew what it symbolized. Daniel's fingers hovered over it but didn't touch it yet. Third, a folded document, yellowed slightly with age. Legal language, names, signatures. Daniel exhaled slowly. Fragments of the past rose uninvited. His father teaching him how to sit straight at dinner, even when there was barely food on the table. His mother insisting he memorize phone numbers just in case. The night everything changed. Men in suits, whispered arguments behind closed doors. His father telling him, whatever happens, stay quiet, stay observant. Back then, Daniel hadn't understood. Now, sitting alone after being mocked, rejected, and erased, the pattern began to surface. He unfolded the document just enough to read the header. It trust. Inactive. Conditions and met. Daniel folded it back carefully, heart steady, mind racing. This wasn't a rescue plan. It wasn't a miracle waiting to happen. It was a test. Somewhere deep inside, a realization settled, not with excitement, but with clarity. They hadn't stripped him of power. They'd been allowed to believe he had none. Daniel closed the box and slid it back under the bed, but this time, he didn't push it far. The distance between him and the truth had shortened. Outside, his phone buzzed, a voicemail notification. A no number. He let it ring out, then pressed play. The voice on the other end was calm, professional. Daniel Cross, this message is to confirm that the timeline your father established is approaching its final phase. When you're ready, we'll be ready too. The line went dead. Daniel stared at the wall for a long moment. Then he stood, straightened his shoulders, and for the first time since Emily walked away, allowed himself a small, private smile. They thought his poverty had broken him. They didn't. No, it had prepared him. Daniel didn't change his life overnight. That was the point. Following weeks looked ordinary to anyone watching from the outside. He still woke before dawn, still wore plain clothes, still took buses instead of taxis. Poverty, after all, was the perfect disguise. It made people stop paying attention. But inside, everything had shifted. At night, after long hours of temporary work, Daniel sat at the small table by his window, laptop open, notebook beside him. Numbers filled the pages. Corporate structures, investment patterns, names that appeared again and again in business news, including one that surfaced more often than most: Carter Construction. He didn't rush. He mapped out a quiet routine formed. Online finance courses, case studies, archived articles about failed companies and sudden buyouts. He learned how wealth moved invisibly, how power changed hands without ceremony. The gold cufflink remained in the wooden box, untouched, but its presence shaped every decision he made. Occasionally, his phone buzzed with short messages from the same unknown number. Not yet. Patience matters. Observation comes before action. Daniel never replied. Flashbacks crept in during the stillest moments. His father standing at a window, watching the city below. Never announce your strength, he'd said once. Let people underestimate you. It gives you time. Daniel understood that now. Across the city, Richard Carter toasted another deal, unaware that a quiet line had begun forming between his empire and a future he couldn't yet see. Emily moved through her polished life, surrounded by comfort, yet haunted by a restlessness she couldn't name, memories of a man who had looked at the world as if it were something to be studied, not feared. One evening, Daniel closed his laptop and stared at his reflection in the dark screen. He didn't look rich. He didn't look powerful. That was fine. Power wasn't in appearances. It was in timing. He reached under the bed, pulled out the wooden box, and this time lifted the gold cufflink. He turned it over slowly, thumb brushing the worn edge, feeling the weight of yours hidden inside something so small. Soon, he whispered, not to anyone else, but to the patience he had been practicing his entire life. Outside, the city moved on, unaware that the man it had mocked for being poor was no longer waiting to survive. He was waiting to return. Richard Carter sat in his corner office, the city spread beneath him like a map of conquest. He tapped a pen against his desk, watching reports flicker across the screen. Everything seemed normal. His empire was steady, profits rising, deals closing. Everything a man of his stature should expect. But small things had begun to unsettle him. A construction bid unexpectedly lost. Investors questioning terms they had agreed to without hesitation. Minor errors cropping up in departments he personally oversaw. Nothing he could yet identify as sabotage, but enough to make the sharpest edge of suspicion prick at the back of his mind. Emily entered the room, her heels clicking on the polished floor. She carried a stack of reports and a faint look of unease. "Father," she said carefully, "the Larson project. There's a discrepancy. Someone adjusted the cost estimates before you signed off. It's minor." But Richard waved her off. "Minor errors happen. Emily, don't give them more power than they deserve." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Something was off, but he refused to admit it. Emily hesitated. Something she couldn't quite name, an intuition born of watching Daniel years ago, made her pause. "Do you think? Could it be deliberate?" Richard laughed softly. "Deliberate? Emily, we are careful. No one in this company has the nerve." And yet, across the city, in a small apartment hidden beneath peeling paint, Daniel studied the same numbers, the same bids, the same reports. He didn't touch his wealth yet, didn't flaunt it. He simply nudged, observed, and waited. Small phone call here, a seemingly coincidental investment there, each subtle movement invisible to those who believed they were untouchable. Daniel's thoughts drifted back to the night Emily walked away. The whispered message he had glimpsed on her phone, the laughter of Richard Carter's peers when they dismissed him as nothing. Every slight, every dismissal, every door slammed shut had been recorded in memory. And now, each tiny correction he made to the city's financial chessboard nudged him closer to the moment when the war that had mocked him would bend and wheeze they could not ignore. A soft ding from his laptop pulled him back, an alert confirming a quiet acquisition he had orchestrated through a shell company. A minor ripple in Richard's portfolio. Minor, but precise. He leaned back and smiled, almost imperceptibly. "Patience," he whispered. "Let them feel secure. Let them laugh again. That will make the moment they realize unforgettable." Across the skyline, the city lights twinkled, indifferent to the invisible game unfolding between the man who had been mocked for being poor and the man who had once believed wealth granted him immunity. But the first cracks had appeared, subtle yet undeniable, and Daniel knew this was only the beginning. Daniel sat in a small, dimly lit office on the 12th floor of a nondescript building. The blinds were drawn, casting sharp lines across his face as he studied multiple screens at once. Each one displayed a different piece of the puzzle he had been building for years. Stock movements, acquisition filings, company boards, insider connections, everything meticulously traced, planned, and poised to tip. He picked up a phone and dialed a number he had memorized for years. "Everything is set," he said calmly. "The Larson project acquisition goes through at 9:03 tomorrow. Confirm all channels are ready." On the other end, a familiar voice responded. Precise and obedient, Daniel had trained his team to act invisibly, like shadows moving in daylight. Every move calculated, every ripple measured. No one could trace the disruption back to him, not yet. Meanwhile, across town, Richard Carter noticed his first real public stumble. A minor investor meeting turned tense as several partners questioned his recent strategy. A report on the company's books contained anomalies small enough to be dismissed by anyone else, but for Richard, they rang alarm bells. Emily watched the meeting unfold with unease. "Father, this is unusual. Something isn't right." Richard waved it off, forcing a smile. "Nothing to worry about, just business growing too fast." But Emily couldn't shake the feeling. She remembered Daniel, the quiet, observant man who had always seemed out of place but never irrelevant. Her fingers tightened around the pen she was holding. A subtle flash of memory hit her, Daniel in a borrowed suit, standing at her father's birthday party, quiet, eyes steady, absorbing every laugh, every dismissal. Daniel's own memory of that night had hardened into purpose. Each laugh, every smirk from Richard and his associates, had been logged and stored. And now, with careful precision, he applied pressure where it would hurt most: public perception, investor confidence, tiny financial nudges that seemed random, but were anything but. By the next morning, small headlines began to appear online. Carter Construction faces minor accounting discrepancies. Investor concerns raised over project management. To the casual reader, trivial. To Richard Carter, a creeping unease. Daniel leaned back in his chair, eyes closed for a moment. A faint smile tugged at his lips. They were finally noticing. Not him. Not yet, but the cracks he had predicted. He opened his eyes, staring at the city below, and whispered to himself, "Patience. Let them feel secure. Let them breathe easy. The world that mocked me, it will not see the next move coming." Across the skyline, the sun reflected off glass towers, indifferent to the quiet war unfolding. But Daniel knew, and that knowledge alone gave him power. The empire that had once rejected him was now exposed, fragile, and ready for the storm he had been quietly preparing. The next morning, the city woke to whispers. A small article appeared online: "Mysterious investor buys majority stake in Larson project." The name wasn't familiar to most, but the numbers were impossible to ignore: an injection of capital that could not be explained by anyone in Richard Carter's circle. Emily scrolled through the report at breakfast, brow furrowed. "Father, look at this," she said, sliding the tablet toward him. "Do you know who this is?" Richard took the tablet, scanning the article. His frown deepened. No, not familiar, but the tightening of his jaw betrayed the flicker of fear that had started months ago with minor anomalies. "We'll find out," he said, forcing control over the moment. "This is nothing to worry about." But Emily hesitated. Something in the writing, the timing, the sheer confidence behind the acquisition felt deliberate. She couldn't name it. She only remembered Daniel Cross, quiet, observant, the man who had stood in this very room years ago and been laughed at. Meanwhile, Daniel sat in his small office, sipping coffee, eyes on multiple screens. To an outsider, he appeared calm, even idle. But every alert, every small fluctuation in the market, every ripple in Richard's network was being tracked, catalogued, measured. He hadn't revealed himself yet. Public recognition wasn't necessary. What mattered was the perception, the anxiety beginning to spread. He leaned back and let his mind wander to that night long ago. Emily's polite smile. Richard's laugh. The words that had cut deeper than any blade. "Love doesn't pay bills. Poverty is not ambition." That memory fueled every calculated step he had taken since. A soft buzz from his phone pulled him back. Another confirmation. One more shell company had quietly absorbed assets previously tied to Richard's projects. Invisible, legal, and touchable. Each small victory was a message they wouldn't see until it was too late. Across town, Richard paced in his office. "Something's happening," he muttered under his breath. Emily watched him, sensing the unspoken truth. "Father, who could be behind this?" He shook his head. "No one that matters. Just a coincidence." But their knees had grown too strong. The empire that had always felt invincible was starting to wobble. And for the first time, both father and daughter felt the presence of a man they had once mocked for being poor, a man who now existed as a shadow in every ledger. Every meeting, every whispered conversation, Daniel sat back in his chair, letting the tension build. They could sense him. They didn't know him. And that, he knew, was all part of the plan. The conference room buzzed with polite chatter, the kind that hid anxiety behind polished smiles. Investors shuffled papers, tapped phones, and exchanged quiet greetings. But all eyes subtly tracked a man they didn't yet recognize. Daniel walked in quietly. Suit perfectly tailored, confidence controlled. He wasn't announcing himself. He didn't need to. Every gesture, every step, radiated the kind of assurance that made others feel slightly off balance without knowing why. Richard Carter's brow furrowed immediately. He scanned the room, adjusting his cufflinks. Who invited him? He muttered under his breath. Emily, seated across the room, froze as their eyes met. Her pulse quickened. That sense of recognition, subtle but undeniable, rose in her chest. It can't be, she thought. Daniel took a seat at the back, unobtrusive, but his presence pulled focus anyway. He opened a laptop, casually reviewing documents tied to the very projects Richard had been proud of. Every subtle movement spoke of competence, authority, and confidence. Richard shifted in his seat. Do I know him? He asked aloud. Though no one had given him the answer, Daniel didn't look up. Instead, he allowed a faint smile to play across his lips, a ghost of memory from a time when laughter had cut deeper than any failure. The meeting began. Investors questioned Richard's strategies. The same minor anomalies he had dismissed before now magnified under scrutiny. Daniel listened, occasionally making notes, occasionally leaning back in his chair, a quiet observer who seemed almost untouchable. Emily's mind raced. She remembered the boy from years ago, in a borrowed suit, polite, silent, absorbing everything. The same man who had been rejected, dismissed, and mocked, someone she had chosen comfort over. Something in her chest tightened. Could it really be him? Richard noticed Emily's distracted attention. Focus, Emily, he snapped softly, irritation cutting through his polished tone. This isn't the time for daydreams. She looked back at Daniel, who had barely glanced her way, but the faint curve of his lips, the same calm, measured demeanor, sent a jolt through her memory. He didn't need to speak. His presence was speaking volumes. A whispered side conversation broke out among a few investors. The name Daniel Cross began to circulate, an unknown investor, suddenly controlling assets Richard thought were secure. Richard's eyes narrowed. Who exactly is this man? Daniel finally spoke, softly, almost casually. I'm someone who's always been underestimated, he said. The words were quiet, but they carried a weight that rippled through the room. And sometimes, underestimated people watch, they wait, they learn. A ripple of curiosity passed through the attendees, though none suspected the truth. Richard stiffened. Emily's breath caught. Daniel leaned back, closing his laptop just slightly, letting the moment hang. The air felt charged. Everyone in the room sensed the shift, the subtle disturbance in their comfortable world, but no one could name the source. And in that tension, one thing became clear. The man they had mocked for being poor was no longer just a memory. He was a presence, calculated, patient, unstoppable, and the reckoning they had long ignored was quietly arriving. The ballroom at Sterling Heights glowed like a cathedral of wealth, every crystal reflecting a world Daniel had once been barred from. Investors, dignitaries, and high-profile guests gathered to celebrate what they thought was another milestone of Richard Carter's empire. But tonight, the room would witness something far more unforgettable. Daniel stepped onto the stage. No hesitation. No announcement, just presence. Every eye turned. The murmurs grew. Whispers traveled faster than sound. Emily felt her stomach tighten. Something about this man, this calm, measured figure, made her pulse race. Recognition collided with disbelief. Richard's gaze snapped toward him, disbelief turning into alarm. That's impossible, he whispered under his breath. Daniel's voice carried across the hall, calm, deliberate, and commanding. 5 years ago, I was dismissed, laughed at, and mocked because I was poor. I was told poverty made me unworthy, invisible, and irrelevant. He paused, letting the words sink into the room like a stone thrown into still water. But today, he smiled faintly, almost gently. The man you believe to be nothing stands here as your equal. No more than that. I stand as a billionaire. And the empire you thought secure is no longer yours alone. Gasps filled the room. Glasses clinked in shock rather than celebration. Emily clutched the edge of her chair. Memories surged: the borrowed suit, the whispered phone message, the laughter that had cut deeper than any blade. Richard's face turned pale. He stepped forward, voice shaking despite himself. Daniel, how? What? This is impossible. Daniel's smile widened slightly. You saw a poor man. You never considered that he might be waiting. You never noticed the quiet observer. You never imagined that patience, planning, and unseen opportunity could rewrite everything. He lifted a tablet and tapped once. On the screens around the ballroom appeared documents, filings, and proof. Carter Construction's minor errors magnified into evidence of mismanagement. Subtle financial manipulations exposed, and assets quietly transferred, all legal, all orchestrated. Emily's eyes widened. It's him, she breathed. It's really him. Richard stumbled back. You played me. His voice was a mixture of rage and disbelief. Daniel's tone softened, almost intimate. I didn't play you. I simply let time reveal the truth. The man you mocked for being poor learned to watch, to wait, and to act when the moment was right. A hush fell over the room. The high-profile guests, the investors, the tycoons, they all understood that something monumental had shifted. The world they had assumed was unshakable had quietly been rewritten by the very person they had dismissed. Emily stepped forward, voice trembling. Daniel, he shook his head gently. You left because you chose comfort over loyalty. That choice was yours. I've accepted it. But let this be clear, poverty never defined me. It was only a chapter. The story, as you see now, has another ending. Richard sank into his chair, defeated, powerless, stripped of the assumption that wealth protected him. Daniel's presence filled the room, calm, assured, and unstoppable. The billionaire who had been mocked had returned, not in anger, but in a way that made every word, every laugh, every dismissal from the past weigh heavy with consequence. Daniel looked once more at Emily. A quiet, final acknowledgement passing between them. He turned, eyes sweeping across the crowd, and spoke for the last time. They mocked me because I was poor. But now, I am the man who rewrites the world. And that shocks everyone. The room erupted not with applause, but with awe. The man who had been nothing had become everything. The laughter of the past had been replaced with the silent, unshakable weight of justice earned, patience perfected, and power reclaimed. And for Daniel, the moment was perfect not because of revenge, but because the story had finally come full circle. Every insult, every door slammed, every dismissal had led here. Every shadow had its purpose. And now, he had stepped into the light, unstoppable, unmocked, unforgettable.